and series. In 2008, he directed his first short film. Between 2002 and 2006, he was president of the Portuguese Association of Scriptwriters and Playwrights. He was a founder of the Federation of Scriptwriters in Europe, to which board he belonged in 2005. Please, let's welcome Paulo Filipe Monteiro.
I thank you all. Let me say a first word of joy for the presence of my master, Professor Eduardo Lourenço. It's a great honor to have you here. For 35 years, my life has been spent interweaving academic work with my work as an actor, director, and playwright and scriptwriter. So I figured that in this conference I should try to actively use and make my two ways of life cross. Alas, I don't have double the time, so I'm afraid I will have to be a little schematic. When Ortega y Gasset wrote The Dehumanization of Art in 1924, or when Walter Benjamin wrote the essay The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproducibility in 1936, both were focusing on the change of art's condition from being a connection to human life and ritual to being a playful art for art's sake. Neither did this text refer specifically to theatre, but they could have, for since the end of the 19th century, even theatre, hard as it might be to imagine it as abstract as, say, painting, was also full of exorcisms of the human. In part, this was due to the overwhelming sentimentality, when not hysteria, that dominated the stage, in part to the important results of abstraction in some other arts, and in part to the rise of the director's role, which led to the utopia or dystopia of a dramatic art free from the unpredictable emotions and impulses of any live performer. A stage without actors, or at least without human actors. The obsession with the marionette, with puppets, was recurrent. I myself was surprised when I discovered the amount of exorcism used against the human, the actor, the emotions, that proliferated for 40 years. So let me reproduce for you this chorus of voices, quoting just the main tenors of this crusade, and I quote them for they still have a major impact nowadays, as we will see. Back in 1757, Diderot had already used the marionette metaphor when claiming that an actor should not fluctuate according to his or her feelings, and I quote, "A great actor is another marvelous marionette whose strings the poet holds." In 1810, Kleist wrote his famous text in which a dancer argues that marionettes have a grace which humans will never achieve. But it is with the late 19th century symbolists that these ideas start invading the stage. In 1890, Maeterlinck wrote that the staging of a masterpiece with the help of accidental and human elements is antinomic. I quote, "The symbol does not stand the active presence of man." He proposed to use wax figures, androids, and puppets. Symbolist poets often prefer to dismiss actors and say their texts themselves, or to display shadows, reflections, sculptures, and mannequins to create non-human poetry. If ever they used actors, they demanded a neutral mask, a white speech, and a static presence. No wonder they wrote static dramas, since motion is hard to find when emotion is expelled. In 1896, Alfred Jarry writes that actors are horrible and incomprehensible objects, that they have to be eliminated or controlled as marionettes. A few years later, Meyerhold starts in this symbolist vein by working on the same marionette metaphor for a still theatre. Then Meyerhold evolves to an idea of depersonalized actors. to be disposed as objects in order to express the interior dialogue through the music and plastic movement, with a neutral voice and impassive face or mask. Later, there is no interior dialogue anymore. In my world, I quote, "In the theatre I dream of, one will expose one's technique and feel nothing inside. Man everywhere, nothing but man. A man doesn't want to create on stage a man's art." In the same period, the futurists are also full of proposals to extirpate the human element from the stage. Marinetti writes against this filthy thing and word psychology. He fancies musical because, among other things, it humorously mechanizes feeling. In some of his pieces, he withdraws actors from full presence, showing only their hands or their feet. Crampolini writes in 1924 that the actor is useless, an absurd compromise, for he is unpredictable and destroys the spiritual abstraction that should reign on stage. Some futurists create shows only with three-dimensional objects in motion, such as fireworks or aeroplanes. Also in Italy, the great actress Eleonora Duse goes as far as to say that all actors should die of the plague. Actors poison the air, they make art impossible. With Gordon Craig, we pass from the marionette to the ambiguous super marionette, which was to supersede the vulgarity of the theatre he knew so well. Craig works on masks. He founds a review called The Mask. He even goes as far as to write "Suppress the actor" and have no live character in which the commotions of the flesh might be visible. The idea of dehumanizing the theatre goes one step further with the Bauhaus. Oskar Schlemmer, who in his very first text quotes Kleist and Craig, works on abstraction through repetition, mechanization and robotic movement. We might wonder why I spent some minutes quoting these 100-year-old theories. It is because I know from my own practice that they are still present but not discussed today. In the mid-80s, Grotowski settled down at the University of California to work on what he called objective drama. So many times since the 80s, I have heard directors say, "I don't want any psychology here." So often do we still now watch theatre, dance or cinema trying to use the famous neutral voice, or post-dramatic actors reading their text in a line in front of an audience, as symbolists would have loved to do. In order to realize how much this anti-emotional acting prejudice still continues, pay attention to what David Mamet wrote in 1998, and I quote, "As a playwright and as a lover of good writing, I know the good play does not need the support of the actor, and that the bad play will not benefit from it. It is as useless as teaching pilots to flap their arms while in the cockpit in order to increase the lift of the plane." Maeterlinck and Mallarmé would have been overjoyed at this metaphor. Mamer continues, "Great drama, on stage or off, is a performance of great deeds with no emotion whatever. The actor should invent nothing. If you learn the words by rote as if they were a phone book and let them come out of your mouth without your interpretation, the audience will be well served." My argument is that in spite of all the fantastic contributions the historical avant-gardes brought, for instance, without Marinetti's experiments, would Beckett have thought of a play where only a mouth is visible? In spite of that, in theatre we have to break away from the system they have built, this aversion to figuration, to the human presence, to psychology, to feeling and emotion, which has led to much more relevant results in other arts, painting, sculpture, maybe even poetry, than on stage. This rupture must be carefully made, and I think philosophy can help us greatly here. Philosophy has always, or very often, thought of drama as the combination of the exterior with the interior. Here the chorus of tenors goes in the opposite direction. Think of Aristotle. His concept of praxis and pathos might seem to be in opposition, but in fact they are related, for every pathos, even mourning or lust, eventually leads to some related praxis, and every praxis is caused by some emotion. Only God, says Aristotle, is pure praxis. Only God and Chuck Norris, one might add. And that's why Norris is so interesting, because emotion comes from the praxis, the action comes from nowhere. No emotion sustains the emotion. The same idea in Kant, and I quote, "Even our internal conscience, of which Descartes did not doubt, is only possible under the condition of external experience." Later, Hegel borrowed from the Romantics the distinction between the three major genres according to two criteria: objectivity and subjectivity. To the epic genre belongs objectivity, to the lyrical subjectivity. But what about drama? It is, according to Hegel, a synthesis of objectivity and subjectivity attained in an advanced civilization. I quote, "In drama we face as much an objective development as its birth in the individual's interior, so that the objective manifests itself as belonging to the subject, whereas the subjective is taken within the range of intuition, as a necessary result of the action and of the quarrelsome interaction with others. In drama, as in life, we have this terrible limitation. Subjectivity has to be objectivized through words or gestures in order to exist. The interior has to take a step forward and come outside, for there is no one but the characters to tell and show their feelings, memories, and deeds." Now, is this philosophy so divorced from theatrical practice, as Barish and Buchner have so vividly been demonstrating? It certainly is from those authors and directors I quoted from the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, and also from those who are still developing a mechanical art or a plasticity without emotion, and also from those who secularize the text. Maybe also divorced from those who pursue an idea of theatre as the revival of the sacred, for there the questions of interior and exterior are conceived in a different way. But I claim that, important as the historical avant-gardes have been, there is no reason but a modernist bias to ignore that many of the modern and contemporary creators, and in my opinion the best ones, are indeed working on this difficult relationship between pathos and praxis. They do not put aside emotion, nor consider that it's just the audience who should get emotional. They need to work on the performance emotions. Pina Bausch invited me in the year 2000 to follow her work in Wuppertal. She used to tell me that her shows were not constructed from the beginning to the end, but from the interior to the exterior. In fact, they emerged from several months of improvisation with the experiences of dancers. And Peter Brook said, and I quote, "The actor must dig inside himself for responses, but at the same time must be open to outside stimuli. Acting is the marriage of these two processes." Does it all sound too simple? It is not. And we all know some actors who are too much in the sun, in the exterior, while others have a rich interior life which they have trouble bringing outside, especially on the large scale required by a stage. Let me run past you some topics that show how intricate this is, and how, once again, philosophy can help us. Valère Novalina wrote a letter to the actors in 1973 during the rehearsals, and she stated, "One day it will be necessary for an actor to donate his body to science, for it to be cut open, so that we may finally know what occurs inside when it acts. We must know how it is made, that other body, because the actor acts with a body other than his own, with a body that functions in the opposite direction. A new body comes into play through the expenditure of acting. A new body or another economy of the old one? We still don't know. It must be cut open while acting. That is how mysterious this is to understand the interior of an actor. That primitive mass, as José Gil says, and I quote, "The artist goes back incessantly to that primitive mass. It is his reservoir of experience, from which he takes the virgin strength of its forms. At the same time, he rebuilds a world already more or less shaped by language. His experience is not pure. It mixes current images and archaic images, emotions that have just gushed from the new image, that image that always comes from who knows where, because it comes from the original chaos that the artist has to reactivate ceaselessly." How can the performer get in touch with this primitive mass? Old Stanislavski put us on the right path. His super objective is the same concern we have been following with the philosophers, and I quote, "In each physical action there is an internal psychological motivation which impels to physical action. As much as in each internal psychological action there is also a physical action which expresses its psychic nature. The union of these two actions results in organic action on stage." Easier said than done. Stanislavski first tried affective memories, but then he realized feelings do not come out so easily. "I've worked for years with a Russian master who used to tell me that feelings are like children. If you ask them to do something, they will do something else." You've got to find your way around the subject to subtly reach what you want. Pina Bausch used to tell me the same. Only through skew, oblique ways can we get to the point. That's why I say Stanislavski found a crucial path, and I quote, "It is a dilemma. Only the unconscious can give us the inspiration we need to create, but we can only use it thanks to the consciousness, which in principle suppresses the unconscious. Happily, there is a way out. It is enough we use a subterfuge. There is in the human spirit certain accessible elements which depend on consciousness and on will, but are in turn capable of acting on involuntary psychological processes." He was right then, and we are still condemned not to start from feeling, to use subterfuges that eventually might get us there. Great playwrights who were also actors knew this very well. Macbeth does not show any abstract repentance. He is busy trying to wash bloody stains from his hands. 2 months ago, I participated in a workshop of Suzuki viewpoints, and at a certain point I asked the tutor where feeling came in this technique. She answered that if you keep punching the floor intensely for a while, you will eventually be surprised at the emotions gushing forth. And so it happened. Anna Bogart, who developed viewpoints, explained this way of working, and I quote, "Due to the pervasive American misunderstanding of the Stanislavski system, rehearsals often become about eliciting strong emotions and then fixing those emotions. But human emotion is evanescent and ephemeral, and setting the emotions cheapens the emotions. Therefore, I believe that it's better to set the exterior, the form, the action, the kata, and allow the interior, the quality of being, the ever-altering emotional landscape, freedom to move and change in every repetition. You work this way not because you are ultimately most interested in form, but paradoxically, because you are most interested in the human experience. You move away from something in order to come closer to it." Peter Brook uses another metaphor, milder than Novarina's dissecation, a metaphor he took from Synge. The actor should not think he immediately has in his interior whatever it takes to imitate Hamlet's sadness or Lear's madness. He must put himself in the same position as the man in the attic who puts his ear to the floor and tries to imagine what is going on inside the people downstairs, who speak and scream in a certain way. And that certain way can be very difficult to reach in Shakespeare or Beckett. So we also have to realize the complexity of what the interior is. The idea or the myth of a person not as a mask persona, but as an internal, intimate arena, an idea that does not exist in many cultures, was developed in our culture, dramatized by Christianity, and has since not ceased growing and threatening the public sphere. It was associated in modernity with Descartes' idea of a self-sufficient ego, stable, unified, homogeneous, where there is no space for senses, dreams, the unconscious, illusion, body. This notion still sustains too many theories, including the Bühler-Jacobsonian model of communication, where an autonomous self sends to another self a clear and distinct message in a docile language. How can we still keep such a distorted conception after the contributions of psychoanalysis, structuralism, post-Heideggerian hermeneutics, and philosophy of language have shown us how the self is opaque and metamorphic, the other is dim and multiple, language itself is not a docile instrument. It is important then to stop for a moment in Wittgenstein's quest for how the interior can be conceived. We will follow Antonio Marx's brilliant book on this subject. In the philosophy of the late Wittgenstein, we find another concept of interior and another way of conceiving the relationships between interior and exterior, beyond the constraints and obvious theoretically insufficiencies of functionalism and behaviorism. But unlike these two schools, Wittgenstein did not eliminate the concept of interior. I presuppose an interior because I presuppose a human being. What he tried to do with all his strength until literally his last days was to elucidate how we can conceive this interior. The inner and the outer is even the main theme of his last writings. When we will mention the primacy of expression, we could also use the term exteriorization, for we will be translating as expression the German word Äußerung, which comes from das Äußere, the exterior. Wittgenstein always sees sense as something inseparable from the linguistic activity of individuals in the context of their practical lives. But there is a serious turn in what is called the second Wittgenstein. Whereas in the Tractatus, language is oriented to a descriptive function, according to what we might call the pictorial or representational theory of language, later, during the 30s and 40s, the same decade as that chorus of artists who spoke out against the human presence on stage, Wittgenstein started realizing the necessity of taking into account activities or forms of life. Instead of a kind of seeing, it is our action which is the basis of our language games. We will say that we know, for instance, a cup of coffee, not only nor above all because we represent this object in a certain way when we hear its name. We know the cup of coffee insofar as we have an adequate behavior in regard to this object. It will be totally inadequate or wrong to hold the cup as when holding an object weighing a kilo, or to take it as quickly to my mouth as when I try to kill a fly set down on my nose. It is interesting to note how the research in the area of the neuroscience confirms that the cognitive behavior of the brain is not grounded primarily in the representation in the brain of an image of reality, but rather in a determined type of cognitive appropriation implicating the body in a reality that can only be explored this way. So, the second Wittgenstein continues to consider as primordial the use of language, but starts to understand in the first place language as an activity, imbricated in a set of activities which shape a way of life. One of these activities, without which we would not get the mastery in the technique of using words, will of course be teaching, learning. Wittgenstein often uses the term Abrichtung, training or dressage. To teach the language is not to explain, but rather to train. A child learns with tremendous efficacy to replace the primitive ouch or cry, the original manifestations of pain, fear, pleasure, desire, and so on, by language games ever more complex, including descriptions, observation, reflection, remembrance, an effort to be precise, the capacity to correct ourselves, comparison. A scream is not a description, but there are transitions, and the words, I fear, can be more or less close to a scream. Man first exteriorizes experience and only later describes them, although the most common image of the relation between experience and language is that each one describes his experience as someone who looks into the interior of a box, our interior, where there are objects which only he himself can describe in the first place. The defense of a private language is deeply rooted in common sense and has a philosophical version in some neo-Cartesianism. The Cartesian position does not admit as essential the distinction between expression and description, for they all happen in the theater of consciousness, populated by mental entities as if they were physical objects, which we can describe through an introspective activity. This concept, so present in common language, is tinged with Platonism, for it assumes a series of entities considered to be independent of the way they are mentioned in linguistic practice. And this is what Wittgenstein seeks to deconstruct. For the predominance of description would lead to the reification of internal objects and to great difficulties of solipsist tenor. The Copernican revolution Wittgenstein operated in philosophy has as its most relevant aspect the primacy of expressive language, without which there would be no mental life translated by means of psychological concepts. The expressive use of language usually occurs with the so-called psychological verbs in the first person singular, and it is in their primitive use that it is possible to say that expressive forms do not admit a simultaneous observation or a perspective by a third person. The symmetry shows up in the simple language games, as for instance, in the paradigm of pain. I have a pain. I doubt he has a pain. So on. A simple grammatical analysis shows that from other people it makes sense to say they have doubts whether I have a pain or not. Of myself it does not make sense. Also, only I can declare with sense that I have a pain. The other can only come to know that I have a pain, but cannot express it. So the real asymmetry is not between a subject who contains in his interior certain objects, sensations, personal experience, which only he himself could describe and know, but true asymmetry should consist in the fact that only I can exteriorize my feelings, personal experience, and so on. The other can only know them using the exteriorizations he observes. We've seen earlier with Hegel how drama potentiates this condition of day-to-day life, of only being able to know what the other has externalized through words or gestures. It is a limitation which the novel does not have, but from which one cannot escape in drama nor in life. Back to Wittgenstein. The interior is a pseudo-entity which should be associated not with the image of a box to which only the owner has access, but rather to expressive linguistic forms that introduce unsurpassable asymmetries between the first-person perspective and that of the third person, and also an authority of the first person regarding his expressive forms, in contrast with the practice of information and observation. I find it amazing that this Wittgensteinian idea of structuring a symmetry between the first and the third persons has not known more theoretic developments, at least as vast as Deleuzean theories in the domain of the performing arts, which are structurally founded on and enriched by the asymmetry between the perspectives of various characters, at least for those who do not expel psychology from the stage. Anyone who has been on stage knows this Wittgenstein is talking about, the authority of the first person, the symmetry between the first person and the third person. This we know very well. there is at least one last topic in which Wittgenstein allows for very dramatic developments related to our theme of objective subjectivity. The question of dissimulation, which in his last years he considered to be crucial. I quote, "The exteriorization of my feelings can be inauthentic. More precisely, they can be dissimulated. This is a different language game from the primitive, the one of genuine exteriorizations. The child has learned to express himself inauthentically in view of certain practical objectives, because it was important for him to dissimulate in this or that situation, to pretend an intention that he has not, or to dissimulate an intention he has." With the introduction of the concept of dissimulation, another and probably stronger asymmetry shows up, the one that refers to the possibility that only I have to present inauthentic expressions, without the other, from the point of view of the third person, being able to perceive this lack of authenticity. And no exteriorization can overcome this uncertainty. Once we introduce the topic of dissimulation, the interior is no longer a pseudo-entity. In a way, the newborn, or a member of some community that would not have the capacity of dissimulating, would not have an interior. Wittgenstein writes, and I quote, "When aspect, gesture and circumstances are not ambiguous, then the interior seems to be the exterior. It is only when we cannot read the exterior that an interior seems to be hiding behind it." So, the rupture of external evidence has, as an immediate consequence, the constitution of an interior. A person grows, acquires more complex behaviors and ever more complicated language games, the external evidence vanishes and an interior gains shape. I quote again, "If the expressive game develops, then in all truth I can affirm that the soul, something internal, develops." Wittgenstein considers one does not live in this state of uncertainty about the authenticity of the other's expressions. He sees dissimulation as a special case. But both the theatrical experience, we can start with the boulevard comedies full of provoked misunderstandings, and the theories that use the dramatic analogy, like Goffman's theory, consider dissimulation, on the contrary, a human condition and a general case. To finalize, let us see how some people in the performing arts have started working along these new lines of thought on the interior and on subjectivity, more inspired by Deleuze than by Wittgenstein, as I mentioned before. In Argentina, Eduardo Pavlovsky and Ricardo Bartisch have digested Deleuze and found it fertile for their scene work. Pavlovsky is a psychoanalyst, playwright and actor who argues that instead of an unconscious to be discovered vertically in each self, we have to work on an unconscious to be unfolded, a story to be opened and extended into new possible stories through the group in what he calls dramatic multiplication or resonant multiplication, and isn't unfolding at the center of all dramatic work. Not only is a good playwright the one who has this strange capacity for multiplying himself in different points of view and different ways of behaving and talking, but the actor is also confronting in every rehearsal and performance with the other actors, not to mention the director and later the audience. Pavlovsky considers we have to stop thinking in terms of subjects. There is nothing but necessities, precise individuations without subject, which are defined through affection and forces, especially in what is in between the subjects. Ricardo Bartisch, in his turn, tries to overcome the problematic influence of psychoanalysis in theatre, claiming we have to create an autonomous machine for producing theatricality, a poetics of acting, which produces disorders, eroticizes the bodies, decomposes the self as much as it composes it. In his proposal, we produce a field of accumulation of energy and of procedures that has to do exclusively with the acting. I quote, "In fact, we go to the theatre not so much to be told a story, but to see people act." So, in opposition to the dominant theatre, where the narrative pre-exists in relation to the body of the actor, who only has to reproduce or represent this previous element, Barthes develops a more fragile theatre, and an exciting one, I can assure you, that founds a poetic territory on the assumption that it will create a privileged instant through which it will produce an event. And this is a theme Alain Badiou has captured from the theatre. "It is similar to our dreams," says Barthes, "where an autonomy inherent to this mechanics starts, referring to the real, but with its own dynamic." Within a totally different frame of mind, Peter Zondi has also claimed that in drama, the event is absolute, for it has detached itself both from the interior situation of the soul and from the exterior situation of objectivity, and founds on its own the dynamics of the work. There is also a growing awareness of the corporal dimension of this autonomous field. Deleuze said in L'Image Temps, "It's not that the body thinks, but obstinate and stubborn, it forces us to think." I would say the body does think. Heidegger already used to relay thought to the hands. And emotions have a decisive place in this thought. The great Chilean actor and director Andrés Pérez used to recommend, "Think through dancing, dance through thinking." The Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa wrote, "O que em mim sente está pensando. What in me is feeling is thinking." And the Portuguese-American neurologist António Damasio has argued that emotions are different from feelings. Emotion is a body reaction, not necessarily conscious, whereas feeling is a mental process that results from emotion, private and subjective, when we become aware of these body emotions. So it's not cognition that imposes its will on emotion. The body emotion comes first and does not exclude cognition. So it's not vague or meaningless to say that performance can think and can have a thought of its own. A better understanding of how body and conscience work can finally let us acknowledge the place of human emotion on stage and of body cognition, without the old fear of feeling or the old association of art with dehumanization. Pina Bausch in the rehearsal kept calling for Gefühl, Gefühl, feeling, feeling. But as she said in a conference here in Lisbon, and I quote, "Feeling is something very exact. It is another comprehension, another language." And language is everywhere. As Pérez said, the problem is not just to feel it, it is to show that you are feeling. There isn't, at least in art, any pure spontaneity. Even graffiti have their own grammar. As Bogart puts it, the actor sets up a complex inner landscape and attempts to remain present within it. But the actor simultaneously actualizes the many languages on the stage, including time, space, text, action, character, story. The accomplishment is an extraordinary feat of juggling many things at once. Andrés Pérez said the actor has to denude himself. But at the same time, he worked with the mask and conventions of kabuki, no, katakali, commedia dell'arte, that he had learned with Ariane Mnouchkine. Who said the emotions are realistic? Expressionism, for instance, with its concern with the expression of the inner self, is a major influence that is not to be ignored, from Tennessee Williams to Pina Bausch. Who said the expression of emotion is necessarily realism? "You must look for another scale in emotions beyond realism," Pérez said. Or, as Anna Bogart wrote, "I want acting that is poetic and personal, intimate and colossal, that expresses who we are and suggests that life is bigger. I want to contribute to a film that will engender moments on stage that broaden the definitions of what it means to be human. Even Brecht, towards the end of his life, spoke, and I quote, of using reason and feeling in a great and fruitful contradiction. Feeling prompts us to a more extreme tension, and reason purifies the feelings. The effective participation of the audience or of the actor must not be precluded. As we know, Brecht's revolution, which he called prose dramatic, was to reject the rules of classical drama, where everything that has an objective manifestation comes from the character's subjectivity. Against the dramatic fusion or confusion between the subject and the object, he worked on their opposition, as the novel was already doing. I'm adding this note because it's quite a change when going against the mental framework we followed from Aristotle to Hegel. Objective elements can now appear on stage independently of any subjectivity, and the spectator sees himself not in the role of subject, but of object. But this is the kind of shift that does not simply take subjectivity away from drama, and much can be built upon that. The Bausch's Gefühl, for instance, is strong because Bausch was a genius of montage. She started from the interior of the dancers, but the dancers told me they didn't understand the show at the premiere. Only after a few performances did they start to have a notion of what it was all about. Now, how can a performer have his emotions and feelings and be organic inside a montage? That is certainly a good question, and something I will try to develop at the April conference in Surrey.
Well, I believe we still have some minutes before lunch for some questions. Over there, please.
Hi, is it me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. It's my duty to ask questions about emotions since this is what I work on. Okay, so there are so many things I'm worried about, using this language of interior and exterior to talk about emotions, because one of the things that philosophy and emotion struggles so hard to do is to overcome this type of dichotomies. So I'm going to just put forward two problems. So one of them is there's a distinction between being sincere and being genuine. And I would have thought that one of the works that theatre does is explore this very difficult distinction. Okay, one problem. Second problem is, emotional world has this
genuine and
sincere and genuine. So somebody can be really sincere, right, about. Actually, I use the examples of Pugmire because he has this wonderful book about emotion. And he says, righteous indignation. You are my daughter. He says, somebody can be really sincere about being righteous and indignant. Oh my God, I can't believe he's got such an expensive car, but be not genuine about the fact that he's actually envious of this person. And it's really hard to point out to this person what's happening. Anyway, this would take us. I don't want to take all the questions to read. Okay, my second point is. So emotion world has layers. It's just the most amazing thing about emotions. So my point is, see, in acting, people work with these layers. It's not just the actor, it's the time that you give to people to absorb what's happening. You can actually stop, and you can do it in theatre and other things, but you can actually stop and give the audience time to feel meta-emotional processes in a way that in ordinary context is very, very hard to give. Right? Sometimes in education we do something similar. When a child is having a tantrum, we go like, okay, let's take a pause. Right? So we give the child and the adult some time for meta-emotion. Like, sort of like, he's crying about chocolate, it's not important. Let's not go bananas over this. So you pause, and in theatre you explore this notion of pausing. Okay, sorry.
Prefer to answer
all the questions. So, in here? Yes, first.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, thank you very much, it was very interesting. I wanted to ask, where do you place John Austin's SpeechX model, which created the platform for thinking of performativity, but did not include, so it seems, the personal, the subject, the emotion of the one who acts, who speaks.
Okay, another gentleman back.
Thank you very much. The question I would raise is maybe methodological in a way, but I think it falls back on many of the issues that you raised about interior and exterior, is to what extent it's possible in the discussion that you're holding to separate the art of acting as a cultural practice, which has its own history. It's different from medical practice, psychological practice. I mean, there are different cultural practices, and what I want perhaps to feel a little more safe, that you're sort of sharpening a difference between the specificity of acting as a cultural practice, because what you're probably, as I feel, saying is that it is a kind of inclusive, all-inclusive sum of so many other cultural practices. You understand my question? You look like a question.
I'm surprised, but okay.
No, but I feel there is a differentiation of acting, because directing is another cultural practice. Talking about theater is another cultural practice, but acting is a specific cultural practice, which you have as your subject matter, but you're approaching it with other cultural practices. Can you isolate acting as a cultural practice?
And over there.
It's all about also it's also about the relationship between interior and exterior. I'm not convinced that in Wittgenstein the problem is between the first person and the third person, but between the first and the second person. And I'm also convinced that, as Wittgenstein says, the interior is used through images. We have several images on interior, and it depends. The relationship between interior and exterior depends on the kind of image you are using without knowing, most of the time, on which is interior. It can be a box, or it can be, for instance, something like our body. We could be cut off, and that we see organs. What kind of interior is that? To see what is at stake when an actor is acting, cut off his brain. We do not see anything about his actings, absolutely nothing. And then it is the image, the several images you use that we must interrogate, and then to see that there's no interior without exterior, and there is no exterior without interior. And for interior, you can use other words: soul, spirit, energy, atmosphere, air, and so on.
Thank you. I grant Filomena was more a comment than a question. Wittgenstein uses soul quite often.
Spirit also.
Spirit.
Also. And physiognomy also.
So I hope my bigger intention was clear, that I don't want to exclude this soul or guys.
Yes.
from the scene, from stage, as the historical avant-gardes have done, and amazing as some of their productions were, we have to break out this system they were working in. Sincere and genuine. I don't know this distinction you are doing, Dina.
But it exists.
I agree. I accept that. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, a man should put on a mask and then be sincere as he can behind this mask.
Yeah, he's pointing out to this problem.
Excuse me?
I think he's pointing out to this problem.
Yes, that's why I'm answering you. The fact that for Greeks this was not so strange, or persona, as you know, relates to the same origin as mask, and Chaplin also said, Charles Chaplin, you've got to, everyone has got to find his character. That's the main thing in life. Others would say, be what you are, but he said, be your character, find your character. I think this theater world is a cultural practice, to answer Freddie, of its own, of course, and with its own problems and its own rhythms and methodologies. I didn't deny that. Although I'm interested in discussing the arts as part of culture and as a critique of culture. Last night, when I went home, I still wrote an email to Herbert Blau saying how much I appreciate his talk, because it is one of the few who works on this way, in this way. In his speech, he was discussing theater and violence in Africa, and this cultural practice is not isolated from the. And I like people like him or Steiner who interrogate culture through art, and art through culture. And I think now trying to relate to the Austin speech acts. Of course, in the 19th century, dialogue was overwhelming in theatre, and it's important to know that there are many more things in theatre than the text, the dialogue, but even the text can be an act. If I say stand up or sit down or forgive me, and this is something he brought, even if he didn't develop it in the same way as I did now. And I would finish with this image by Ibsen in Peer Gynt, because I do believe, speaking of interior and exterior is dangerous. That's why we need philosophical help, and I came to Wittgenstein for help. But one of the reasons why I keep acting, and I think many of us do, is because we try to denude ourselves. We try to go deeper and deeper. Take one mask, take another mask. But knowing, as Peer Gynt, in this famous scene of the onion, that he takes, he starts peeling the onion, right? Remember? And there's another layer. Oh, this is the man who served in Africa. Oh, this is the one who preached here. And this is it. And it goes on and goes on. And so he says, is there no end to it? Where is the heart of the onion? The onion has no heart, no essence. So I'm not at all for this philosophy of essences. I believe that what we are doing is peeling the different layers and trying, when we have the courage to do it, trying to get closer to getting deeper. That's what I have to say. I don't know if there are...
Is there any